Hello. Best.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to the Royal Overseas League for this evening's book talk. My name is Jeff Parkin, and I'm the artistic director here at this unique institution. For those of you who have never been here before and are new to us, we're an international membership organisation. We have members in over 60 countries all around the world, and we're very lucky to have this beautiful clubhouse here in central London. We have 83 bedrooms upstairs, bars, restaurants, nice places to hang out and relax, and a beautiful garden, which is always open in the summer. And we're slightly different from some of the other clubs in that we have an arts programme, which I run, and that's all geared towards helping and supporting young musicians, writers and artists at the start of their careers. We have an annual music competition, visual art exhibitions and residencies, scholarships for Commonwealth musicians from all over the world, and all sorts of things. And we also have this events programme, and we love programming these book talks. I'm absolutely delighted, thrilled, and we're very privileged to have with us today Pat and Jean Owtram, and along with their very good friend and their literary agent, Simon Robinson, who's going to take us through this talk today. Simon persuaded Pat and Jean to write this remarkable book, Codebreaking Sisters, which is on sale outside, and Pat and Jean will be around to sign at the end. It's a really incredible story of how they supported the war effort at Bletchley Park and elsewhere, and the work that they did during the war helped to turn the tide for Britain. And so it's an amazing story, and I'm sure you'll enjoy the slides and hearing them talk today. There will be an opportunity for a few questions at the end. We'll raise the lights a little bit, and if you do get selected for a question, could you just wait for either Robin or I to come with one of these microphones? We're live streaming to about 50 people around the world as well, so it means that they will be able to hear the question as well as everyone in the hall. At the very end, if you could just allow us a clear space to allow Pat and Jean to get out to the desk at the back, they will be available to sign books for you and answer any questions you might have out there rather than in the hall itself. And we will be serving wine at the end. And if you take a glass of wine, feel free to take it up into the central lounge so that everyone is nicely spread out. But I think that's enough for me. I'm now going to hand over to Simon, and I wish you a lovely evening. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. It's so nice to see you all here. And I'm very proud to be here with Pat and Jean. I think you'll enjoy this evening. As we've all experienced, every one of us being locked down and not doing things so much. And it's very nice to see so many people here today. For Pat and Jean, who had given quite a few talks, there was obviously quite a break with everything that was going on in the world. So it's quite nice to have a live audience again. So I think what we'll do is start at the beginning, if that sounds like a good idea, Pat. This is Newland Hall, where you grew up. Would you share a few memories of your childhood with us?
Yes, well, this was our grandfather's house, but he was a widower, and after our mother and father got married, he invited them to come and share the house with him. So this is where we grew up. It's about 5 or 6 miles outside Lancaster, right in the countryside. There was a home farm. We had a pony. There was even a little lake at the end of the garden with a boat on it. So it was a very nice place for us to grow up as children, wasn't it?
Yes, lovely. We enjoyed it, and our grandfather, who was a widower, spent a lot of time with us. Amazing how much we found then. And he enjoyed showing us things which he enjoyed and taking us around. So we were really perhaps rather spoiled. But anyway, we were very happy being spoiled.
There's a lovely picture of you both here, Jean. I think we were talking about this on the way. You can remember the photographer's studio where you had this taken, can't you?
Yes, this was some way from our own home because it was a very good portrait photographer in Kendal in Westmoreland called Winspear Herbert. And I do remember being taken over there to have our photographs taken, some with our mother, some just on our own, wearing our best party frocks, I think, usually. So this was probably the first one he took. He did do some later.
And a slightly earlier picture here, we've got your mother and father and both of you in the pram. I still find it amazing that the date on this is 1927, and here we are in 2022. It's quite amazing to me. Pat, would you tell us actually about your father in the First World War, and then your mother's slightly unusual role as well in the First World War?
Yes, well, our father was 18 in the last year of the First World War. He was just old enough to serve in the Royal Marines, which he did. Our mother was in the Women's Land Army, and she was working on a farm near Preston. The nearest town to our home was Lancaster, and the next one was Preston. And so they met and got married.
And I saw a newspaper article about your mother being one of the first women to drive in her area.
Yes, well, our mother was, I think she inherited some money when she was 21, and she bought a car, and hardly any girls at that time had cars, but she did. She learned to drive, and she was a very good driver all her life.
And took the vegetables to market and so on from in the Land Army.
Yes, she used to, she worked for a farm, and she used to drive a truck with all the vegetables and things into Preston Market.
And now, this might be rather unfair because we haven't been through this, but Jean, could you remember the name of the dog on your mother's lap there?
Oh, was that Benji? No, I'm not sure what it was.
That's Muji.
Muji, that's it, yes. I knew it was a G dog. But yes, and dogs in my lifetime, should I perhaps not say they were always more important than anything else, but they came very near to being.
I wanted to share these with you all to give some sort of impression of Pat and Jean's upbringing and what life was like in the years before the war. Unusually, you didn't both go away to school. You had a series of nannies and governesses. One nanny in particular had a bit of an effect on you for the rest of your life and gave you a sort of a mantra that I think you both still abide by. Pat, could you share that with us?
Yes, well, she was rather more Jean's nanny than mine, but she was a very good nanny, and she taught us when very young, if we fell over or whatever it was, to say it might have been very much worse. So we would sort of rub our greased knees and say, oh, it might have been very much worse. So we've rather lived by this mantra. Usually it's quite true that things might be very much worse.
I think I said it yesterday or something.
I think earlier today, actually, another thing that's really testament to these amazing sisters. When I arrived at Pat's house earlier today, I saw an ambulance outside the house, and I felt very worried and inquired, how Jean was, and then was poised to call Jeff and apologise that unfortunately I didn't think we'd be able to go ahead. And one of the first things that Jean said was, "I'm all right, I'm still coming." And I don't think the paramedics would even disagree with you. And actually, you've been fine. But Jean did say earlier, she said, well, it might have been very much worse. And I thought, well, there you are. This photograph for me is quite poignant. This photograph represents one of the last holidays that the family took together in 1939. Pat, could you tell us a little bit about that holiday?
Well, most of our holidays were in Scotland because our father liked fishing for trout and salmon, and we always liked going to Scotland. And we did have this holiday in the late summer of 1939. It was looking very ominous that there might well be a war, and I think it really was the last one we had for many years because our father was on the territorial reserve and he had to join his regiment, when the war broke out. And of course, one didn't have holidays, really, in the war, not proper holidays.
There was quite a rush back, wasn't there? You'd gone with a caravan and with the car.
Oh, yes. We went to the west of Scotland, and we were camping and had a caravan, and we used to go to a little farmhouse and listen to their radio, and of course it looked more and more ominous, and our father had to rejoin his regiment, so that was the end of our last pre-war holiday.
And you had to come back by train, didn't you? And there was an IRA bomb scare, and your parents had to race back with the caravan. Your father joined his unit. And then I remember you telling me that you were on your way to church and you knew there was going to be a broadcast, and you rather hoped that the church service wouldn't go ahead.
Well, yes, because as you will remember, it was a Sunday morning when Neville Chamberlain said that we were at war with Germany. And we listened to this in somebody's radio in a house near the church, you know, and I thought, oh, good, they'll cancel the service. And then, much to my disappointment, we all had to go in and have the whole church service before we got together with some friends. This is in North Lancashire, and I thought German bombers would be over any minute, you know, but actually it wasn't a very sort of vulnerable part of the country.
We were in the period of the phony war, and as you say, people were expecting bombs to fall, and nothing very much was happening. Your father was away and was training, and you know the war was going on at sea. Two very important, or people that would turn out to be very important in your lives, joined your household just before the war broke out. I've brought up the pictures behind you of Lily and Edith. Would you like to tell us all a little bit about Lily and Edith?
Yes, well, being right in the country in Lancashire, our grandfather had difficulty in getting English maids or cooks, and he found an agency in London that was looking for jobs for desperate Austrian Jewish refugees who would, you know, probably never have been a cook or maid, but just to get to the safety of England, they would take those jobs. So from the 1930s onwards, we always had an Austrian cook, sometimes an Austrian housemaid as well. And when they came, they often didn't speak much English. And I spent a lot of time in the evenings with Mrs. Lily Getzel. They were from Vienna, do I mean Vienna? Yes, I do. They came from Vienna, and they had wonderful things to tell us about the operas and the concerts and the music. And with the result that I, as a schoolgirl, had pretty fluent German with an, I suppose, slight Austrian accent.
Interestingly enough, in 2019, I'd arranged a radio interview for Pat with a German radio station, actually. They were interested in hearing her story. And when the journalist arrived to do the interview, he said, do you think Pat could do the interview in German? I said, well, actually, 75 years ago, I think be pushing it really. She might, if you give her a few minutes, she might be able to do an introduction or something like that, and checked with you. So Pat did her introduction, and then he responded in German, and then so did Pat. And for about an hour and a half of this recording, I sat really unsure of what was being said, but hugely impressed. And again, you know, never underestimate these women, really. After 75 years, your German was still there. But do you remember his comment to you?
Well, you asked him, I think,
yes.
what he thought about my German.
Yes. And he said, well, it's very good. It's a very clear Viennese accent. And after all of these years. So, and the other thing that was actually quite poignant in one of the breaks between the lockdowns in 2020, Edith's daughter came to see Pat, and she was, I think she must be possibly about 80, And she had the letter that Pat's mother had written to her mother in Vienna in 1938, offering her a job. And she needed that letter as a guarantee of employment to be able to get her exit visa to be able to come over. And you know, this amazing lady was being very grateful to Pat, and of course Pat was being very grateful back for, you know, all of the help and support that they'd received as well. It was very touching. And you're still in touch also with Lily's son as well after all these years.
Very much, and I might say Jean also learned German.
Yes.
And you learned German, didn't you, from Lily and Edie?
So it wasn't a very correct German necessarily, but it was understood. And when I eventually went out to to stay with her family in Italy,
you went to Vienna
yes.
just after the war,
yes,
didn't
yes.
you?
Yes, and I was really rather astonished that I was able to talk to people and they could understand what I was saying, because I always thought, no way am I a good speaker. But it worked. So I do recommend it as a way of learning a language. Just go and enjoy it.
Definitely. There's a photograph of your father here, and at the time he was Major of the Blackpool Regiment, 139th. Field Artillery Regiment, and you saw him on and off through some of his training, didn't you, at Salisbury Plain and places like that. But of course, in the end of 1941, your father got his embarkation leave. Pat, could you tell us, how did it feel? How did you feel knowing that your father was going overseas?
Well, he was so pleased about it that, you know, although he hadn't, but because he'd done a lot of training and he really wanted to get involved in the real thing. So I used to see him quite often because I had a job at that time in London. He was on Salisbury Plain, and they had farewell dances and things like that, which I went to because I was 17, 18. I realized as he was pleased and excited that I couldn't really regret the fact that he was going overseas. He just wanted to see some action.
Your diary entry says that your grandfather opened a bottle of 1894 port or something, and you said it's rather strange, there's almost a party atmosphere in the house.
There was, wasn't there?
This was at Newland at our home. Yes, very strange, because I thought we should all be terribly upset and we were losing people going away and all that sort of thing. All the bit, we enjoyed every minute of it.
He did.
Until perhaps later. There's a photograph as well that your father took of all of you just before embarkation. And Jean, you're still at school. I think you've probably got a year left at school before you go into uniform. Now, Pat, there's a photograph here of you in a greatcoat in the Wrens, but I wonder if we could just go back a moment to Lily and those German lessons that you'd been having with her. When Pat was a child, she'd had bovine TB, so it was pretty much certain that she wouldn't probably get into the services because her health might not have been, you know, A1 or what they were looking for. But Pat had a bit of a special skill to put down on the application. Could you take it up from there, Pat?
Yes, well, I applied for the Wrens because my mother's brother, Uncle Charles, was a career naval officer, and Uncle Charles was my godfather, and he said, of course, the girls will all want to join the Wrens. So I did volunteer for the Wrens. I wasn't very optimistic because, as Simon says, I hadn't got the greatest of health records with recurrent attacks of slight tuberculosis from the cows, which weren't in those days TT tested. But anyway, I went for a medical and an interview in Liverpool. I think the fact I knew German outweighed some doubts about my health, and they said I could join the Wrens, but not serve overseas. But luckily, that didn't really matter.
No, because you were actually in the best part of the world, really, to be listening into the German Navy, which is what you'd done. But we slightly jumped ahead. You had some Morse training, I think. Was it at Wimbledon? Were you trained in Morse?
Well, yes, the Wrens had a general training place in North London, and then there were one or two specialised courses at a house in Wimbledon, and one of these taught girls who did know German how to search the wavelengths, the frequencies that the German Navy used, and write down as accurately as possible their messages. And I remember they started with very simple messages, and then they got more complicated or speeded up, and they needed to make sure that we could keep up with anything we might hear. And when you completed this course, you were given the immediate rank of petty officer Wren. And so you missed out all the bit of being an ordinary Wren and having rather nice uniform and a little cap, because you went straight into a tricorn hat and some brass buttons and things. Still, I did pass the German test.
Do you remember the moment that you signed the Official Secrets Act?
Well, it was certainly at the beginning of the course,
yes,
not at the end. But the Official Secret Act had absolutely dire penalties, including death. So you did tend to rather keep it.
And I remember you saying to me at first, when they asked you to sign the Official Secrets Act and they told you a bit about the work, you were a bit frightened they had something else in mind for you.
Was I? Yes.
Did you have the idea that you might have to jump out of an aeroplane?
Oh, yes, that was it. I thought I might be trained as a spy, and I would have to jump out of an aircraft somewhere in Europe where I would never have been because we didn't go abroad on holidays. You know, I was absolutely terrified over this. I was so relieved to find that the job I was going to do could be done from the east coast of England and no need to go abroad.
And actually, just a word on that. Pat was part of an organisation called the Y Service, and the branch of the Y Service existed within the RAF, with the Army, with the Navy. And Pat, your work really was interception. You were listening into German surface shipping, E-boats, and you were recording the Enigma codes that you heard coming through. And if I ask nicely, and Pat will only be doing this really for me, and hopefully you'll all enjoy this, could you demonstrate how the equipment worked that you used to listen to the German Navy?
Yes, we had radio sets like this one. We knew the frequencies the German fleet used, and we only searched those frequencies. So you would slowly sort of move the dial around, and then you might pick up a sort of rushing noise, and that would be a German radio set warming up, because they always warmed up their radios before they started transmitting. So you would sort of hold on to that, and then with any luck you would get one of their signalmen calling up another ship or land base or whatever it was. But the frequencies for the German fleet, and those were the ones that we listened to. Other people in the Women's Air Force and so on were listening to other radio messages, but we just concentrated on the German fleet. And we had little listening stations down the east coast and along the south coast. They were called Y stations because the letter Y stood for naval intelligence for some reason. So we just searched particular parts of the network.
And you had to have really intense concentration, because can you imagine when you're just listening to something with headphones, you're trying to pick up these crackly letters, and you've got perhaps bombers going over or shelling warnings happening, shells being fired. and you've got to keep that concentration through the night and on night watches as well. It was, it could be quite a lonely job, really, couldn't it?
Well, we had these little stations with about 12 linguist wrens, and we had cooks and stewards and one German-speaking wren officer running it, and a mechanic to keep the sets going. And it would have been a lonely job, but there were usually two of you in the watchroom, and you always needed an extra person if you did get a signal up to go and ring either naval intelligence if it was operational, like I have completed mine laying, I'm returning to base or something from a German ship, or if it was in a 4-letter Enigma code, that had to go straight to Station X, which was Bletchley Park, and we used teleprinters for that. So you needed more than one person in the watchroom, and if there was a German ship up, the officer would always be called, and she would tell the nearest naval base what we were picking up. It could be very, very boring. You could have a blank night, or it could be very intense activity. So they rather tended to select people they thought could cope with rather different situations. Sometimes
you would hear plain language messages that you'd pass on to, or would be passed on to the Admiralty. Can you remember one or two of those? I was thinking about the ones that you were telling me about, completed mine laying and returning, or there was a funnier one as well about somebody going on leave.
Oh yes, I do remember one German coastal battery, I suppose it was, talking to another one and say, no, it was local motor torpedo boats actually. One of them saying to the other operator, did you know that Bobby Fimmon's crew are all going on leave next week? And he said, oh, sie machen alle Kinder was? They're all going to make babies, are they? But those weren't, well, they were useful messages because then we knew that these particular boats wouldn't be operating. So even something trivial could be worth reporting.
Absolutely. And I want to bring you in, Jean. And Jean, you'd left school and you were helping your grandfather, and he was logging his dairy pedigree shorthorn herd of cows, and you were involved in sort of those kind of agricultural things, but you wanted to get into the war. And I think you applied for the Wrens, and they were full at the time, and an aunt had an idea about the First Aid Nursing Yeomanry.
Yes, and I was just trying to think of what the First Aid Yeomanry did. But I think they were doing First Aid Nursing Yeomanry. I can't remember.
So when you went for your interview at Baker Street, you were quite annoyed, weren't you, when they started asking you if you had a particular skill? Do you remember what skill they were asking you?
I think it was something terribly basic. Was it something to do with making meals and
with about crosswords?
Oh yes, that was the one. Yes, I could do crosswords, and I thought this is absolute nonsense. I'm not going to sit in England doing crosswords while everybody else is working. And then I found that this was in fact how we found out what our enemies were doing all the time. And if you could do the crossword or the language or something like that, you had a much greater chance of being successful and useful to people than if you did the more technical things.
Well, they were looking for people with quick brains that could solve puzzles quickly, which yes. you obviously could do.
Yes, just use your mind. You don't have to use your knowledge.
And you started off at F section in Baker Street, and a name that might be familiar to people that are interested in Second World War history, Leo Marx.
Yeah.
So Leo Marx headed Jean's section, and Jean was actually there at one of the most poignant moments in Leo Marx's life. He had, well, you weren't sure at the time where he'd gone, but he wandered into your office and all of you wished him a very happy Christmas. This was the Christmas of 1943, Do you remember how he reacted?
It is not a very happy Christmas, is how he reacted. And the people who were suffering all over Europe and the terrible things that were going on and so on and so forth, and then walked out leaving us all in floods of tears. Didn't help the war very much.
But what had actually happened was his girlfriend, or perhaps his fiancée, Ruth Hambro, had been killed in an air accident. And he actually wrote about this in his book. He'd been up onto the roof and really thought, what was the point in going on with life? It was around this time that he wrote that very famous poem that some of you will know from Carve Her Name with Pride. He gave this special poem, The Life That I Have, to Violette Szabo as one of her coded messages. So that was a sort of real moment of history, I think, Jean, that you were sort of on top of. But you obviously scored very well when you were at Baker Street, because you were selected with a group of some other First Aid Nursing Yeomanry to go with the S.O.E. across to North Africa. And I wonder, actually, Jean, if you could share with me that memory. You told me about leaving Liverpool in a blackout, everything blacked out.
Yes, I mean, because England was totally undercover. It's got dark at night, nobody can see anything. And well, one of the first things I saw was the lights in our home. Well, my mother went all around the local villages, putting out lights for people, that sort of thing, and came back. To our horror, found every window at my home seemed to have a light in it. But that just happened to be like that.
I was thinking of the lights of the northern coast of Africa.
Oh, yes. Well, then we set off from Liverpool in our boats we were going out to. Didn't know where we were going. We just knew we were going south somewhere. And we sailed down the coast of France until we got to Gibraltar. And Gibraltar was ablaze. There were lights everywhere. And we turned in there, and I thought, we were all going to be killed on the spot. But in fact, we sailed right the way through the Mediterranean, and nothing happened at all. But there were lights all over the place in North Africa, but nothing whatsoever in Europe. And that was quite spooky. And you see, looking at a black wall one side and a blazing, colourful wall the other.
And it was a very anxious time for your mother, because you were only 18, so you needed parental permission. Do you remember, how did you go about getting parental permission? Because your mother wasn't keen for you to go. How did you persuade your mother to allow you to go?
Yes, my mother was not going to release me because her husband was somewhere in a prison camp. And, but my grandfather, who had been around the world as a boy and was now well into his 80s, 90s, and he knew what it would feel like if I was told I couldn't go overseas, I couldn't do this, couldn't do that. And so he backed me, and with his help and guidance, I finished up in North Africa, yes, in Cairo, and went from there into Europe. So my grandfather and I were rather inclined to share each other's feelings and understand perhaps rather more what we felt like.
Jean was a Code and Cipher Officer, and she'd been picked out for having a particular skill in dealing with undecipherables or corrupted messages. You were dealing with the Allied agents' messages, and so it relied upon people like Jean to work out why these messages were not following their normal formula. Had the person fallen into enemy hands, or were they just under severe stress? So requests for more ammunition and this kind of thing. Jean, you were actually a section leader of your leader. You got a promotion. But it was very intense work. And I think around the intense work, you found some time to let off steam when you got leave, and went against regulations hitchhiking.
Oh, I'm so sorry, but I seem to have lost rather a lot of bits of memory. Hitchhiking?
I was talking about you hitchhiking when you got to Italy.
Oh.
And moments when, for instance, you got picked up in a lorry to drive back, but then suddenly the war came home to you when you asked him, by the way, what's in the back?
Yes, and there was corpses in the back. But that did shake me a little bit. But then he said, you can take over. And I'd never driven a lorry in my life before. I drove it from then on, feeling rather basic. You know, I've got corpses in the back, and I'm driving a lorry. What
Quite macabre.
heck do I do if I want to stop it? Or, I had no idea what you did to stop a lorry. But anyway, luckily, at some point, we got to a corner or something where I pressed the right logs, and somehow the thing stopped. And then I said, I think I've driven long enough, and handed it back without admitting that I hadn't a clue what I was going to do next. Then it was all right. And of course, after that, I learned how to drive.
You had to get used to, you were operating with supporting partisan groups in Yugoslavia, and you got to know some of the agents that were going overseas. You wrote in sort of later years about how it felt to suddenly have been friends with somebody and then suddenly you wouldn't see them again and you couldn't ask any questions.
Yes, this was at Christmas, I think, wasn't it? We were, the English were getting together to celebrate Christmas, and the news came through that somebody's great friend had been killed. And we had to get through Christmas decorations and everything else without telling the rest of our English group. And I remember the problems you felt in trying to keep somebody's morale up when you knew what they were going through and what it was like, and somebody was dead and so on. But we just knew that we had to keep things going. You couldn't give way. You had to keep doing best to support everybody. It was hard work, honestly.
And actually, Pat, for all of your family, it was very hard knowing that your father was a prisoner of war, but never knowing from 1 month to the next, or sometimes from 1 year to the next, whether he was still alive. He was taken prisoner at the fall of Singapore. Actually, I think in something like, what would it be, about a week and a half or something, it'd be about the 80th anniversary of the fall of Singapore. And your father actually wrote an account. He kept a secret diary, actually, through the time that he was a prisoner of war, hid it in bamboo poles and then in an oil drum in a grave, and retrieved it after the war. But I think it's very poignant. He says that the last days of Singapore held vivid memories of the frequent roar and concentration of bombs falling on defenseless areas of the city as flights of Japanese bombers flew over us with no opposition other than a few troops of 3.7 heavy ack-ack. And when those guns, though blazing as fiercely as they could, began to run out, we knew that soon they would come. Fires in the dock area were blazing and oil tanks and cast a pall of black smoke by day and a lurid glow by night, the whole southern skyline covered in blackness. Then came the unconditional surrender at 4 p.m. on the 15th of February. That really brought the war home at Newland, didn't it? Your mother was always looking at the lists of prisoners. Could you talk to us a bit about that time?
Yes, well, of course, once he'd embarked, we didn't at first know where he was going, but it was to Malaya. And to begin with, you know, it seemed quite all right, but then they just, as Simon says, they had no adequate anti-aircraft guns, no defense really against the German bomber, the Japanese bombers, and they were all taken prisoner. And because he was camp commandant of an Allied prisoner of war camp by the river, what I know as the River Kwai in Thailand, of course, he had to negotiate with the Japanese, and he did, I think, save a great many lives because he was firm about things like using exhausted men working, building the railway and all that.
There was a letter, actually, I think in the Manchester Guardian, somebody wrote after your father had died to say, no matter how many beatings your father took, his steadfast refusal to send men out onto the railways meant that even the Japanese had to concede in the end that, perhaps your father was right.
And of course, the other thing he did was to keep a diary, which they were not allowed to do, so it had to be done very secretly, because he felt that there would be a possibility of war trials after the war, and there should be a record of the courage and the experiences of the Allied prisoners. And he used to bury leaves of this diary, which he wrote up every week, in the graves that they had for the many prisoners who died. So at the end of the war, he was able to recover his diary.
And actually, one of the things I was going to come on to actually was that Pat and Jean managed to have their father's war diary published about 4 or 5 years ago. He'd tried himself in the 1950s, but kept meeting with the sort of comment that nobody was interested in the war anymore. That was in the 1950s. But of course, you realised his ambition for him, really, at a time when a lot of people are more comfortably retired. So I think that was amazing. Well done. Pat, there's a very good photograph of you here on your 21st birthday when you were at Abbots Cliff. One of the other stories that I'd like to share with everybody was about the lengths that some of you Wrens were prepared to go to if there was a German landing, if there was a sort of a coastal raid. You had an armed guard of military policemen at Abbots Cliff. Could you talk to us about that?
Yes, well, Abbots Cliff was a Wren station, a naval station, where we could listen to the ships, the German convoys and warships in the Channel. But of course, it was in rather vulnerable situation if there was a German commando type raid or anything like that. So it was the only station where we had armed military police to guard it if need arose. And some of us thought, well, we would rather like to use those light machine guns that these military police had. And so we asked if we could do a bit of target practice. We used to go to a field across the road, set up little targets, and then practice firing these Sten guns, So I think I'm probably the only respectable old lady in Chiswick who still knows how to fire a Sten gun.
That's excellent. And Pat, another story that actually I wanted you to be able to share with everybody, it's something quite brief. It was just, do you remember when a very senior Wren officer came to one of the stations and you were all explaining the difficulty listening to the headsets and the interference and so on, and what was her understanding of what you were doing?
Yes, she became really rather notorious because at the end of this tour of the station, she said, well, you say you have all these problems with signals fading and interference, and why don't you ask them to send the signal again?
Quite worrying, isn't it? There's another photograph of you here with your younger brother. This is at the point just before actually Jean's embarkation and just before you went to Abbots Cliff. I wonder if we could have another go at what's the dog's name in this photograph?
Which was that?
You've got a black spaniel just there.
Yes, it was our mother's spaniel. What was it called?
Who is there? Oh, Moodry.
No, it wasn't
No,
Moodry.
it wasn't Moodry, it was another one.
Moodry was a Celium.
Yes. Oh, well, we've lost him.
Here
Dogs
you
were
are
important.
with your mother here, Jean, just before you went overseas as well. And this is Abbots Cliff. This was your more important station that you were based at.
Well, it was just opposite Cap Greenay. I mean, you could see the sun flashing on the windscreens of cars going up the cliffs opposite. It's between Dover and Folkestone, and it was a very good situation for listening to German radio signals. But it was a bit of a vulnerable position, and as I said, I think we had these armed military police guarding it. We were still able to have parties in the war, because I had my 21st birthday party there, and it was about a fortnight after D-Day. So not all our friends were available, but quite a lot of them managed to come. And
you wrote a letter to Jean here, and you said, the house we're in is pretty ghastly. Everything rattles unceasingly in the gale, and I'm in a large untidy room on the ground floor with 6 other women, but they're all very nice. There's a doss house atmosphere. It doesn't matter. Anyway, what does anything matter when you can see France from the window?
Yes, which you could, of course.
And now this, I really like this photograph because we were able to arrange for Pat and 2 women that she served with at Abbots Cliff to go back in 2018. And this was their old watch room, which has been made actually into a more sort of comfortable hotel type atmosphere now. But I'm looking at Pam, who is sitting next to you there. I thought it was very poignant what you told me about when D-Day was happening, her excitement. Would you share that with everybody?
Yes, well, D-Day, some of us were asleep after night watches and things. One of the Wrens came round saying, it started. But some of them were particularly affected because, like Pam, she had a fiancé over the other side who was a prisoner of war, you know, and I remember her saying to all of us, you know, we're going to get him, we're coming to, you know, free him. And no doubt in the course of time we did, but it had a very personal sort of significance for some of the Wrens I was with.
Another significant moment. What does this mean to you, Pat?
Well, it was 8 o'clock one morning and I'd been on night watch. We had a separate building where you could take bearings, and if you got a German signal up, you swung aerial controls round and got a direction to which other stations could then pinpoint if they could get one to. But I'd been in this building overnight, came out and thought, this can't be true, because coming over the cliff were a whole bunch of staff officers, and in the middle of them was the Prime Minister, Winston Churchill. And I thought, what on earth is he doing at 8 o'clock in the morning on our cliff? But he did, in fact, visit the Dover area more than once, particularly in the period running up to the D-Day landings, because it was quite important to make the Germans think we were going to do a landing, which they would know from their spies, but it would be in the Dover area. And I think one reason why Churchill was there, probably the only reason that morning, was that it would be reported, as it was, and the Germans got the reports, that Churchill had been down in the Dover area, whereas, of course, we were going to go 50 miles further west into Normandy.
Well, it was all part of Operation Fortitude, and the part that you played in that, as you were walking along, you didn't have a hat on, did you? You weren't wearing your hat.
Oh, yes, and you could only salute when you were wearing a hat, you know. So I thought, what do I do? All these senior officers coming past. So I just waved and said, morning, morning, everybody. And Churchill and all of them waved back and said, good morning, good morning. So it was perfectly all right.
And because, you know, we could easily, I think, spend an hour on each of your roles during the war, and that of your father as well. I had a quick glance at how we were doing with time. So I'm going to slightly draw the war to a bit of a close, well, the war in Europe anyway. And Jean, I'm going to ask you if you would read your letter that you wrote to Pat on VE Day, because I think everyone would.
Was this a letter to my mother?
This is to Pat.
Oh, to Pat. Yes. Do you want the rest of that letter?
I think if you can bear it, I think this side.
Time to sleep. We were up at the Allied Officers Club when the news came through on Monday night. I can't give you the date, we get further down. They brought round copies of the Union Jack special edition, which we all took in those days, and there was a poster up on the wall saying, "Germany, the end, peace in Europe." No one started breaking the place up or anything. We read the paper as we danced, and everyone looked a bit dazed, and we could find the excitement and relief all over the room. It was too much to take in, I think, at that stage. And anyway, it hadn't finished everywhere. Now, where did I got to? The end. I read, they brought round copies of the Union Jack special edition.
Yes.
I've read it already.
Yes.
Right.
I think if you, because I think it's very nice if you could pick it up from just there.
So we went down to Taranto, that bit.
Yes.
Yes, because I was in southern Italy at the time. So we went down to Taranto as I was off duty to have lunch in the mess, the officers' mess there. And we all listened to Churchill on the mess's canteen television. And when we got upstairs afterwards, every ship in the port was quoting his sounding his siren, and all the flags were out, and people were letting off revolvers into the air and all around us. It was very impressive. And as usual, I wanted to cry. This always happened when we had something dramatic. And in the evening, I was on duty, so we heard the King's broadcast in the office and all the programs about it. And I said, "Oh, honey," I was writing to Pat, "this is all so dramatic and happy and wonderful. It's almost worth the 5.5 years before." And that, I think, was how we all felt at that moment when the war finished. And Churchill's message to the Far East was so hopeful. He said, "Lift up your hearts, for we are coming." And he sent this message out to the Far East. And it was really, we suddenly realized the war was over for us. It still had to go on in the Far East, but that was the end. And I think it was one of the great moments in all our lives. Now, I think that is probably...
Thank you, Jean.
That's how it felt.
And Churchill's message about lift up your hearts and we are coming, you had another 3 months really until VJ Day, until the war ended in August of 1945. And your father didn't come home until, I think, the September, almost October. There's a photograph of him taken by the Swedish, the Swiss Red Cross. This is at the point that he was retrieving his diary. Do you remember the moment that he came home, Pat?
Yes, because my mother managed to arrange it so that we would all be able to be there when he arrived back home. And we were, and he was very little changed, because we thought he'd be terribly thin or something, but no, he looked very much like himself. Arrived back home. I think he went fishing the next day or two. You know, it was wonderful.
And there's a photograph of you all together at Newland, and I think it's quite interesting. Your father, obviously in uniform, when he went off to the war, Jean, you were still at school and had long plaits, and Pat, you just left school.
At the end.
Yes, and you all went out actually to a family wedding at the Mayfair Hotel, And it was the first time that you'd been able to sort of be on your own to chat with your father.
Yes.
Could you tell us about that?
Yes, well, when he got back, he visited members of the family, some of whom lived in London. So he came up to London, and as Simon says, we all went out to lunch at his dinner, I think, at his hotel. And he said, would you girls like a drink before dinner? And Jean and I said, yes, thank you, we have whiskey. He said, girls don't drink whiskey. He said, they drink sherry. Have a sherry. So he hadn't realized quite what had happened in his absence.
This is their father's book. This is 1,000 Days on the River Kwai, which is really his diary, his experiences at the time, written in the 1950s, that Pat and Jean managed to have published in about 2017. Now, Pat, years after the war, just because of time, I'm going to give a bit of a summary, and then you interrupt me if I'm wrong and correct me. But after you went out to Norway and worked for the British Embassy, you did an ex-service grant, and you went to St Andrews University. And following St Andrews University, you went to Oxford University. And then following Oxford University, you went to Harvard.
China.
And that wasn't bad, really, for a girl who'd been told that university was for boys and not for girls. Following on from that, you spent some time in the US, and you were offered a role as a journalist on the
Newsweek.
Newsweek.
Yes.
And you turned it down, because you wanted to go back to England, and you worked for the Daily Mail. And then we've got a very good photograph here of your time at Granada. Could you tell us what you're doing there at Granada?
Yes, well, I was with the Daily Mail in Manchester when Granada arrived on the scene, and built a studio and so on, recruited staff, and luckily I knew some of the people in Granada, and they offered me a job, first of all with Northern News, and then it turned into a program production job. I was producer for several years with Granada, and I think this must have been the first
University Challenge.
Yes, first productions of University Challenge that I produced with Bamber Gascoigne as chairman. Is that Patrick?
Yes, that's you with Patrick Moore.
When I did change from working for Granada to working for the BBC in London, because they were recruiting producers for BBC Two, and I didn't, much as I liked Manchester, want to stay my whole life there. And so this was one of the anniversaries of...
I think it's the 200th episode of
200th
Sky at Night.
episode. Patrick always liked celebrating anniversaries, so we certainly would have had a party. And I took over the Sky at Night from the producer who'd done it from the beginning, because he was going to produce a new series called Chronicle. The things he was really keen on were astronomy and archaeology. So they were looking for somebody to take over the Sky at Night on the proviso that they could get on with Patrick and he could get on with them. Well, I found Patrick absolutely delightful, and when they did the moon landings, we went over and interviewed the astronauts and people. I had an extremely interesting time with the Sky at Night. We went to Russia, I remember. Oh, Patrick went to Russia. I couldn't go at the last minute, but he went.
And does anybody remember the series Ask the Family? Pat devised that and produced it as well. So
well, they wanted a really cheap series to fill an early evening gap in the summer. And I thought, well, families wouldn't cost anything, you know, and we'd give them presents of a practical kind, like a record player or a boat or something. And I thought it was just to run that summer. In fact, it ran a great deal longer, didn't it?
Yes, absolutely. Well done.
I think it was 16 years.
And Jean really caught the bug for going abroad, and you spent quite a few years with various jobs working with the Refugee Commission. Then you were a social worker in the 1950s, and then you were Lancaster University's first careers advisor. You had a real soft spot for the people that were failing on their course. You liked to help them find careers that would be suitable for them.
Yes, I felt that I myself had managed to get through quite a lot of an interesting, enjoyable life without having all these wonderful successes that other people seem to have. If you were interested in something, you could get a job and you could go on and you could find particularly the people who were doing it who had not succeeded. But you could say, well, look, it's okay, have a go. If it doesn't work, I got half a dozen different jobs at different times and I had a lovely time. And I was able to, I found, to work with the unsuccessful much more than with the successful. And it gave me much more satisfaction. If I was working with somebody who had been told they weren't any use, I said, okay, neither was I, and I've had a lovely life. And I felt that had been worth all the things I'd missed and hadn't done. I mean, I managed to do the things I wanted to do as well. But I thought we are far too critical of a lot of our people. And if they can't do the top jobs, then they shouldn't be allowed to go to university, et cetera, which is nonsense.
And there's a photograph. I'm racing to close this. This was I think this was your 95th birthday. Again, probably one of the lockdown periods. And the First Aid Nursing Yeomanry, of which you remain a member always, and they still do brilliant work. They're always involved and sort of frontline when it comes to things like terror attacks and disasters and things. 1907, I think they were set up. Pat, in 2019, was awarded a Légion d'honneur for work supporting D-Day with a smart reception at the ambassador's residence. And in 2020, Pat and Jean both represented women of the Second World War at the Festival of Remembrance. So I always sort of had an idea that when people were in their 90s, probably you had a quieter sort of life, and not so for Pat and Jean. I'm sorry I've sort of raced through the end of this. I would ask if anybody has any burning questions or anything like that. But just before I do, I'd just like to very much thank Pat and Jean for their time today and for sharing their memories. And thank you so much to all of you for being a great audience. And Jeff, thank you for inviting us. Does anyone have a question?
No questions.
Oh, there's one, I think.
One just there for Patrick.
First, thank you very much for the talk. It's been an absolutely fascinating hour. I'm very interested in how your collaboration started, the three of you. How did you meet?
Well, I met Pat at a classical concert with a concert pianist that I look after. I've been interested in the Second World War probably since I was about 11. So I found a polite way of gauging whether somebody is old enough to have served is to say something like, were your parents in the war? And then if they were in the war, they'll say, well, I was. And then you say, oh, what did you do? And then Pat told me about being in the Wrens and told me about her father's book that was coming out. And she was a bit worried about publicity. And so I volunteered to help her with that. And we became friends. And then I heard more about Jean, and we went and met Jean. And then I was desperate for them to both have a book of their own because they kept appearing in other people's books. So whenever historians wrote books about Bletchley Park or something like that, Pat's story would be there, but perhaps not with Jean's. And so to bring their book together and to have their stories together was something that I managed to persuade you both to do.
Oh, yes. Well, you know, made our later years much more interesting. You know, we've done very enjoyable tours to book festivals and things like that. So it was quite unexpected at our advanced stage that anything would happen, but it has, like we're here now.
Any other questions?
Well, you've stunned into silence. So
Yes.
I think in that case, as we're on...
Is there one?
Have you got... Okay, we can do one more if you can get there, yeah.
Hello. Yes, it's working. I just wanted to ask, was it... you were very, very young when the war finished, but I wondered if... Was it at all difficult to readjust immediately after having such an intense experience, to readjust into a life post-war?
I'm going to repeat the question because I'm sitting nearer. I'm going to slightly paraphrase. How was it adjusting after the war to civilian life? How did you find it?
To go back again.
To civilian life.
It seemed terribly flat, terribly boring. We'd been after traveling around what I had in the Middle East, and I was with people with totally different backgrounds than my own, and we were hearing a lot of what was going on in our countries. I could have gone out to the Far East, but our father had been a prisoner of war and was coming home, and our mother said, no, you must be at home for when he comes back. He's been through a terrible time. So I didn't go out to the Far East, but I did do it later. But I think we had such a lot of experience of things which 19-year-olds, 18-year-olds, which I was at the time, never experienced normally, and we saw a lot of people and a lot of things and places that we would never have seen otherwise. So there was a great advantage, curiously, in the terrible disaster of a great war, but we learned a lot more about people who lived in different worlds, different experiences from our very comfortable life in an English country home. So I don't regret any of the things we lived through.
Thank you, Jean. And for you, Pat, how did you find adjusting to civilian life?
Well, I had various jobs towards the end of the war, like translating official German documents that would be probably used as evidence at Nuremberg and so on, but nothing like as interesting as listening to ships if they came up. So I was quite glad to leave the Wrens in the autumn of 1945 and go out to Oslo to help staff the reopened British embassy. But the son of the consul in Oslo was at St Andrews University, and he said, well, why don't you get a university grant and get a degree? So I came back and went there and got a degree, and they gave me a grant to do a B.Lit at Oxford, and I think Simon sort of mentioned that I then got an exchange fellowship to Harvard Graduate School for a year. So I had a long academic sort of spell, after which what I really wanted was to earn some money. So I came back and became a journalist, and then when television sort of opened in Manchester, they were looking for someone to produce documentary programs, so I did that, and I went on to London and produced programs for the Granada and the BBC in London. So I had a very, I suppose it was a bit sort of here and there, but very happy working life.
Excellent, excellent. I think that's probably about all now. Can I just very cheekily, and it's really quick, and hopefully this doesn't backfire on me, Jean, the importance of secrecy. When you were at Baker Street, you had to take different routes to get to work, and you had to get off of the bus at different stops, And one particular day you were getting off the stop and the conductor rang the bell as you got off and called out.
Yes, I was being very careful not to say anything, not to let documents lie on my lap, anything. I was very careful. And then I heard the conductor's voice loud and clear saying, "Any more spies?"
Well, Pat, Jean, thank you so much indeed for joining us and for telling us all about your remarkable lives. We all owe you a debt of gratitude for what you did during the war. And I forgot to mention earlier that Jean does still live in Lancashire and has come down especially to visit, to do this talk for us this evening. So we're so grateful to you. Please do join us for a glass of wine outside and to have a chat with Pat and Jean, and do buy their book and get it signed. And I wish you a wonderful evening. Thank you very much.